Sofia Martinez had perfected the art of invisibility during her 3 months working at Chicago's Grand Metropolitan Hotel. At 24, she'd learned that the wealthy guests preferred their service staff to blend into the expensive wallpaper, silent and efficient as ghosts moving through their world of marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Tonight was no different as she pushed her cleaning cart down the hallway toward the presidential suite. Her blonde hair twisted into its usual neat bun, blue eyes focused on the task ahead, while her mind wandered to tomorrow's psychology exam. Room 4012 belonged to Alexander Romano, a man whose presence commanded attention even when he wasn't there. For weeks now, he'd reserved the suite for what the front desk diplomatically called business meetings, though Sofia's psychology training made her suspect these weren't ordinary corporate affairs. Something about the way his associates carried themselves, the expensive suits that couldn't quite hide the suspicious bulges beneath their jackets, the way conversations stopped when hotel staff approached. Her criminology professor would have called them classic indicators of organized crime, but Sofia preferred to mind her own business and collect her paychecks. The suite should have been empty. Romano always left for dinner at 8:30 sharp, a routine Sofia had unconsciously memorized over months of cleaning around his schedule. She knocked twice on the heavy mahogany door, waited for the standard 10 seconds hotel policy required, then used her master key to enter the most expensive accommodation the Grand Metropolitan offered. The living area was pristine, except for a leather portfolio lying open on the mahogany coffee table, papers scattered around it like fallen leaves after a storm. Sofia knew she should ignore it, finish her cleaning duties, and leave without letting curiosity get the better of her. But something about the documents drew her closer, her psychology studies having trained her to notice patterns others missed, to read between lines that most people never even saw. Financial records filled the pages, territory maps of Chicago's South Side marked with red ink, names she didn't recognize paired with dollar amounts that made her monthly salary look like pocket change. Transportation routes, warehouse locations, personnel lists with coded notations she couldn't decipher. This wasn't legitimate business. This was the kind of operation that made headlines when things went wrong, the kind that left bodies in rivers and families wondering what happened to their loved ones. A voice from the adjacent bedroom made her freeze mid-step, her cleaning spray suspended halfway to the glass coffee table. Vincent Torres, Romano's right-hand man, speaking in urgent whispers into his phone. Sofia had seen him dozens of times over the past 3 months, always perfectly dressed in tailored suits, always wearing that calculated smile that never quite reached his dark eyes. He moved through the hotel like he owned it, treating staff with polite dismissal while radiating the kind of quiet menace that made smart people step aside. Now his voice carried an edge she'd never heard before, desperation mixed with ambition in a combination that made her skin crawl. "The Mexican connection is solid," he was saying, pacing near the bedroom door with sharp, agitated steps. "They want the South Side territory, and I can deliver Romano's head in exchange. Thursday night, during the warehouse meeting. He'll never see it coming because he trusts me completely." Sofia's blood turned to ice, her hands trembling as she set down the cleaning supplies. She was hearing a murder plot unfold, a betrayal that would end Alexander Romano's life in 3 days. Every rational thought screamed at her to finish cleaning and pretend she'd heard nothing. Getting involved with dangerous men was exactly the kind of mistake that destroyed ordinary lives, turning psychology students into statistics. But she couldn't move, couldn't force her feet to carry her away from Vincent's voice as it continued, growing more confident with each treacherous word. 7 years I've been his loyal dog, watching him make decisions that should be mine, taking orders from someone who inherited power instead of earning it. The Mexicans understand ambition better than Romano ever will. They recognize talent when they see it, and they're willing to pay for results. Thursday night, we end this charade, and I take what should have been mine from the beginning. The sound of footsteps in the hallway outside made Sofia panic, her heart rate spiking as she recognized the measured pace and confident stride. Romano's voice, unmistakable even through the thick door, was growing closer with each step. He was returning early from dinner, probably forgotten something from the scattered documents that painted such a detailed picture of his criminal empire. She had seconds to decide where to hide before being discovered eavesdropping on a conversation that could get her killed. Or worse, make her disappear entirely into the kind of fate that befell people who knew too much about the wrong things. The bathroom door stood slightly ajar, offering the only concealment available in the otherwise open suite. Sophia slipped inside just as Romano's key turned in the lock, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would give her away to anyone with functioning ears. Through the crack in the door, she watched Vincent emerge from the bedroom, his expression shifting seamlessly from conspiracy to casual loyalty, like an actor changing masks between scenes. "Alex, you're back early," Vincent said, his voice betraying nothing of the murder plot he'd just been orchestrating with Mexican cartels. "Everything all right with Maria?" "Forgot the Patterson contracts," Romano replied, his deep voice carrying that subtle accent Sophia had never been able to identify. Italian, maybe, or something else entirely European. The sound of it sent unexpected shivers down her spine, rich and controlled like expensive whiskey. Can't finalize territory agreements without the proper documentation, and you know how these Chicago families get when paperwork isn't perfect. Territory agreements. The same territories Vincent had just promised to Mexican cartels in exchange for Romano's assassination. Sophia pressed herself against the bathroom wall, trying to make sense of what she'd witnessed while fighting the urge to hyperventilate. The loyal right-hand man planning his boss's murder, promising to deliver criminal territories to foreign organizations, all while maintaining the perfect facade of devoted service. "I'll grab them and head back to the restaurant," Romano continued, his footsteps moving around the suite with purpose. "Maria's expecting me, and you know how she gets when I'm late for our anniversary dinner. 23 years together, and she still makes me nervous when I disappoint her. Anniversary dinner. This dangerous man, this criminal who controlled territories and commanded fear throughout Chicago's underworld, was worried about disappointing someone named Maria. The contradiction fascinated Sophia, despite her terror. Even monsters, apparently, had people they loved, relationships that mattered more than power, or money, or the violent business that funded their lives. Vincent's laugh sounded forced to Sophia's trained ear, the kind of false amusement she'd studied in her behavioral analysis classes. "Don't keep the lady waiting. I'll lock up here and see you tomorrow morning for the harbor meeting." "Actually, stay a few minutes," Romano said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "I want to review Thursday's warehouse arrangement once more. Something feels off about the whole situation, and my instincts have kept us alive this long." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. Romano's instincts were warning him about Thursday, the same night Vincent had just finished planning his murder with Mexican allies. But did he suspect his most trusted associate? Or was he simply being cautious about business as usual? The irony was almost unbearable. He sensed danger everywhere except from the man standing 3 feet away, plotting his death. 2 sleepless nights had passed since Sophia discovered Vincent's betrayal plot, and the weight of that knowledge sat on her chest like a stone she couldn't dislodge. She'd barely touched her breakfast both mornings, spending her free time researching everything she could find about Alexander Romano and his organization online. What she discovered surprised her in ways she hadn't expected. Unlike the sensationalized violence portrayed in movies, the Romano family operated with what the Chicago Tribune called old world principles. Their territories had lower crime rates than areas controlled by rival families. They funded community centers, protected local businesses from predatory lending, and rarely made headlines for the kind of brutal warfare that plagued other criminal organizations. Alexander Romano, it seemed, was a different breed of dangerous man, but that didn't make her decision any easier. Warning a criminal about an assassination attempt would make her complicit in whatever happened next. Yet allowing Vincent to murder someone, even someone whose hands weren't clean, felt like a betrayal of everything she'd been raised to believe about human decency. By Wednesday morning, Sophia had made her choice. She couldn't live with herself if Alexander Romano died because she'd chosen convenience over conscience. The question now was how to deliver a warning without getting herself killed in the process. Room service provided the perfect opportunity. At precisely 10:30, Sophia knocked on the presidential suite door, carrying a silver tray laden with Romano's usual breakfast order, fresh coffee, and her racing heartbeat. She'd volunteered for the assignment, claiming the regular room service attendant had called in sick, which was only partially true since Sophia had paid her $20 to trade shifts. "Come in," Romano's voice called from inside, that rich accent sending the familiar shiver down her spine despite her terror. She entered to find both men exactly as she'd hoped and feared. Romano sat at the dining table reviewing documents, dressed in an impeccably tailored navy suit that made his gray eyes look like storm clouds. Vincent stood near the windows, his own expensive attire carrying subtle differences that Sophia's psychology training helped her identify. The tighter shoulders that suggested concealed weapons, the restless energy of someone planning violence. "Good morning, gentlemen," Sophia said, proud that her voice remained steady as she approached the dining table. "I have your usual breakfast, Mr. Romano." Alexander looked up from his papers, those penetrating eyes studying her face with the kind of attention that made her feel exposed despite being fully clothed. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or curiosity about why the cleaning girl was suddenly delivering room service. "You're not Maria," he observed, referring to the regular attendant. "She's feeling under the weather today," Sophia replied, beginning to arrange items from the tray, with hands that trembled only slightly. "I hope the substitution isn't an inconvenience." Vincent had turned from the window, his dark eyes tracking Sophia's movements with the predatory focus of a hunter sizing up potential prey. Something about his attention made her skin crawl. A primitive warning system inherited from ancestors who'd learned to recognize danger in the wild. "How thoughtful of you to step in," Vincent said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Alex appreciates dedication in service staff, don't you, Alex?" The casual use of Romano's first name in front of hotel staff was a power play Sophia recognized from her social psychology courses. Vincent was establishing dominance, reminding everyone present of his privileged position within the organization. But it also presented her with the opening she needed. As she reached across the table to place Romano's coffee cup, Sophia deliberately caught the edge of the sugar bowl with her elbow. Porcelain shattered against marble flooring, white granules scattering like snow across expensive carpet. The crash was loud enough to mask her whispered words as she leaned forward to apologize. "Thursday night," she breathed directly into Romano's ear, her lips nearly brushing his skin as she pretended to examine the damage. "Vincent and the Mexicans, warehouse meeting, betrayal." Romano's hand stilled on his coffee cup, but his expression remained perfectly neutral. Only the slight tension in his shoulders suggested he'd heard her warning. Vincent stepped forward immediately, his suspicious nature triggered by the intimate proximity between Sophia and his intended victim. "Careful there, sweetheart," Vincent said, his tone carrying subtle menace despite the endearment. "Expensive things break easily in the wrong hands." Sophia's heart hammered as she knelt to gather porcelain shards, acutely aware of both men watching her every movement. Vincent's words carried double meaning that wasn't lost on her. She was the expensive thing that could break easily if handled wrong. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Romano," she said, looking up at him with what she hoped appeared to be simple embarrassment. "I'll have housekeeping replace the sugar bowl immediately." "Accidents happen," Romano replied calmly, but his gray eyes were conducting a thorough assessment of her face, searching for something that made her pulse race. Though some accidents are more revealing than others. The loaded statement hung in the air like smoke, leaving Sophia uncertain whether he believed her warning or suspected her motives. Vincent's presence near the window felt increasingly threatening, his casual stance failing to hide the coiled energy of someone prepared for violence. "Vincent," Romano said suddenly, his voice carrying new authority, "I've been thinking about our partnership." "Oh," Vincent's response carried forced lightness, but Sophia caught the micro-expression of alarm that flickered across his features before he regained control. 7 years is a long time for anyone to serve as second in command, Romano continued, standing with fluid grace that transformed the casual conversation into something more formal. "Perhaps it's time you branched out on your own, explored new opportunities." The euphemistic language didn't fool anyone present. In the criminal world, exploring new opportunities was often a polite way of saying someone's services were no longer required. Vincent's face went pale beneath his carefully maintained tan. "Alex, I don't understand," Vincent said, abandoning his position by the window to approach the dining table. "Have I done something to displease you? Let's just say I've received information about your expanding business interests," Romano replied, his tone remaining conversational despite the deadly undercurrent. "Particularly your enthusiasm for our Mexican neighbors and their territorial ambitions." Vincent's eyes flicked to Sophia, who was still kneeling among the scattered porcelain, and she saw the exact moment he realized she'd been the source of Romano's sudden suspicion. The calculation in his expression shifted from confusion to recognition to murderous intent in the span of a heartbeat. "You're making a mistake, Alex," Vincent said, his hand moving toward the inside of his jacket. "That little cleaning girl doesn't know what she's talking about." But Romano was faster, his own weapon appearing with the fluid precision of someone who'd survived in this business through superior reflexes and constant vigilance. The elegant businessman vanished, replaced by the dangerous predator Sophia had always sensed lurking beneath expensive suits and polite conversation. "The mistake, Vincent, was trusting someone who'd sell me out for territorial control," Romano said quietly. "Walk away now, and you might live long enough to regret your choices." Vincent's hand froze on his weapon, the mathematics of survival calculating rapidly behind his eyes. He was outgunned, outmaneuvered, and caught in betrayal so obvious that denial was pointless. Sophia held her breath, certain she was about to witness an execution in the presidential suite of Chicago's most prestigious hotel. Instead, Vincent slowly removed his hand from his jacket and stepped backward toward the door. "This isn't over, Alex," he said, his voice carrying promises of future violence. "You'll regret not killing me when you had the chance." "Perhaps," Romano replied calmly, "but I've never regretted showing mercy to someone who served faithfully, even if that service ended in betrayal." Vincent's exit was swift but controlled, the door closing behind him with deceptive softness that somehow felt more ominous than slamming would have. Sophia remained kneeling among the broken porcelain, afraid to move or speak until Romano's weapon disappeared back inside his jacket. Romano's presence filled the suite with dangerous energy as he holstered his weapon and turned his full attention to Sophia, who remained kneeling among the scattered porcelain fragments. His gray eyes studied her with an intensity that made breathing difficult, calculating something behind those storm-colored depths that she couldn't begin to decipher. "Stand up," he said quietly, his voice carrying gentle authority that somehow felt more compelling than any shouted order. "You're bleeding." Sophia looked down at her hands, surprised to see thin lines of crimson where porcelain shards had sliced her palms during the confrontation. The adrenaline had masked the pain completely, but now sharp stings began registering as her nervous system caught up with recent events. Romano moved to the bathroom, returning with a first aid kit that seemed suspiciously well stocked for a hotel suite. He knelt beside her, his proximity sending unexpected heat through her body despite the circumstances. When he took her injured hands in his, the contact sent electricity straight to her core. "Why did you warn me?" he asked, dabbing antiseptic on her cuts with surprising gentleness. His hands were larger than she'd expected, calloused in ways that spoke of physical work despite his expensive lifestyle, warm and steady as they cradled her trembling fingers. "Because letting someone die when I could prevent it felt wrong," Sophia replied honestly, watching his dark head bent over her hands. This close, she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtly masculine that made her pulse quicken. "Even if that someone is a criminal?" Romano supplied, glancing up at her with something that might have been amusement. "You can say it, Sophia. I know what I am." The casual use of her name sent shivers down her spine. She hadn't told him what to call her, which meant he'd researched her background thoroughly enough to know details about her life that should have been private. The implications were both terrifying and oddly thrilling. "Vincent won't give up easily," Romano continued, wrapping gauze around her palms with practiced efficiency. "He spent years planning this betrayal, building relationships with Mexican cartels who want Chicago territory. They'll send reinforcements within 48 hours, and you're now the primary witness who can identify their local network. What does that mean for me?" Sophia asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It means your life as Sophia Martinez, psychology student and hotel housekeeper, ended the moment you chose to save mine," Romano replied, securing the bandages with medical tape. "Vincent will assume you're working with me now, which makes you a target for elimination." The casual way he delivered this death sentence made her knees weak. She tried to pull her hands away, but Romano's grip tightened just enough to keep her still without causing pain. "I have a job, classes, a life that doesn't involve any of this," she protested, her voice rising with panic. "I can't just disappear because I did the right thing." "Your dedication to normalcy is admirable," Romano said, standing and pulling her up with him. The movement brought them close enough that she could feel heat radiating from his body through the expensive fabric of his suit. But Vincent has connections throughout Chicago's service industry. He'll find you within hours if you return to your usual routine. So, what are you suggesting? My family has a secure property in Lake Forest, about 45 minutes from the city, Romano explained, his hand still holding hers despite the completed bandaging. You'll be safe there while I deal with Vincent and his Mexican allies permanently. The word permanently carried implications that made Sophia's stomach flutter with complicated emotions. She should have been horrified by the casual reference to murder, but instead found herself wondering what other situations Romano handled with such decisive finality. I can't afford to miss work or skip classes, she said weakly, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew how ridiculous they sounded given the circumstances. Your employment has been handled, Romano replied smoothly. The hotel received notice that you're taking emergency leave due to a family crisis. Your professors will be informed that you're dealing with a personal situation requiring extended absence. Sophia stared at him, realization dawning like cold water. You've already arranged everything without asking me. I've arranged to keep you alive, he corrected, his grip on her hands becoming more possessive. The rest is negotiable, but your safety isn't optional. Before she could protest further, Romano's phone buzzed. He answered with crisp efficiency, speaking in rapid Italian that Sophia couldn't understand but recognized as instructions being given to subordinates. The foreign language rolling off his tongue was unexpectedly sexy, adding another layer to her growing attraction despite the dangerous circumstances. Marco will be here in 10 minutes, Romano said after ending the call. Gather anything you need from your apartment. We leave immediately. The next hour passed in a blur of organized chaos. Marco turned out to be a mountain of a man with kind eyes and deadly hands, who drove them to Sophia's modest studio apartment, while Romano's other associates swept her building for potential threats. She packed essentials under Romano's watchful eye, acutely aware of his presence in her personal space. This is temporary, Romano assured her, as they prepared to leave everything familiar behind. Once Vincent's threat is eliminated, you can return to your normal life if that's what you choose. But even as he said it, something in his expression suggested that normal was no longer an option for either of them. The way his eyes tracked her movements, the possessive edge in his voice when discussing her safety, the careful attention he paid to her comfort despite the crisis, all pointed to complications that extended far beyond simple witness protection. Lake Forest proved to be an understatement for Romano's idea of a safe house. The estate sprawled across manicured grounds behind wrought iron gates, all stone architecture and pristine landscaping that screamed old money and established power. Armed guards patrolled discreetly, their presence obvious to Sophia's trained eye, but invisible to anyone without her psychological background. The interior took her breath away. Marble floors reflected light from crystal chandeliers. Artwork that belonged in museums adorned silk-covered walls, and every surface spoke of wealth accumulated over generations rather than quick criminal profits. Your room is upstairs, second door on the right, Romano said, leading her through the grand foyer. Maria prepared it this afternoon. The same Maria from your anniversary dinner? Sophia asked, remembering his concern about disappointing someone important. Romano's smile carried warmth she hadn't expected. My aunt, actually. She raised me after my parents died, and she runs this household with more authority than I command in business. The humanizing detail struck Sophia as profoundly intimate. This dangerous man, this criminal who commanded fear and respect throughout Chicago, answered to an aunt who scolded him for being late to dinner and prepared guest rooms for unexpected visitors. Maria turned out to be an elegant woman in her 60s, gray hair pulled into a neat chignon, wearing the kind of understated jewelry that cost more than most people's cars. Her shrewd dark eyes assessed Sophia immediately, cataloging details with the efficiency of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and opportunities. So you're the girl who saved my nephew's life, Maria said, her accented English carrying approval. Alexander told me what you risked for a stranger. That shows character. I just did what felt right, Sophia replied, uncomfortable with praise for actions that had upended her entire existence. Doing right when it costs you everything is the true measure of a person, Maria observed. Dinner will be served at 8. I trust you'll join us." It wasn't really a question, and Sophia found herself nodding agreement despite the surreal nature of being invited to dine with criminals in a mansion that could have hosted royal families. 3 days of living in Romano's estate had settled into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Sophia spent her mornings reading in the library, afternoons walking the manicured gardens under discreet guard supervision, and evenings dining with Alexander and Maria in the formal dining room. The conversations ranged from surprisingly normal topics to glimpses into a world she'd never imagined, where business decisions involved territorial disputes and family loyalty meant everything. What she hadn't expected was how natural it felt to be part of their evening ritual. The way Alexander's eyes sought hers across the dinner table, or how Maria had begun treating her less like a temporary guest and more like family. The dangerous attraction she'd felt toward Alexander had only intensified with proximity, every casual touch sending electricity through her system. Tonight felt different, though. Alexander had been tense all day, taking multiple phone calls in rapid Italian, his usual composed demeanor showing cracks that worried her more than she wanted to admit. When he'd suggested retiring early, Sophia had reluctantly agreed, though sleep seemed unlikely given the nervous energy radiating from him. She was brushing her teeth in the guest bathroom when the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing everything in an eerie red glow that transformed the elegant estate into something from a horror movie. Sophia's psychology training had taught her to recognize the signs of coordinated assault, and this had all the hallmarks of a professional operation. Alexander appeared in her doorway before she could even call out, his presence both reassuring and terrifying in the crimson shadows. He'd changed from his dinner attire into dark tactical clothing that made him look less like a businessman and more like the dangerous predator she'd always suspected lurked beneath expensive suits. "Vincent found us," he said grimly, pressing something cold and heavy into her hands. She looked down to see a pistol, its weight both foreign and oddly comforting. "Do you know how to use this?" "Basic safety course in college," Sophia replied, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "But I've never—" "Point and pull the trigger if anyone threatens you," Alexander interrupted, taking her free hand with gentle urgency. "Stay close to me, and do exactly what I say without question." Gunfire erupted somewhere on the ground floor, muffled by thick walls but unmistakably violent. Alexander pulled her toward what she'd assumed was a linen closet, revealing instead a hidden door that opened onto steep stairs leading into darkness. "Panic room," he explained, guiding her down stone steps that felt like descending into a medieval dungeon. "Reinforced steel, independent air supply, communication equipment. We'll be safe there until my men handle the situation." The panic room was smaller than Sophia had expected, maybe 10 feet by 12, lined with monitors showing security feeds from around the property. She could see muzzle flashes in the darkness outside, figures moving with military precision as they attempted to breach the estate's defenses. Alexander sealed the heavy door behind them, engaging multiple locks that sounded like a bank vault closing. The space suddenly felt impossibly intimate, their bodies only inches apart in the confined area, his masculine scent mixing with the metallic tang of recycled air. "How did they find us?" Sophia asked, watching the monitors with horrified fascination as the battle raged above them. Alexander's jaw tightened as he studied the feeds. "Your phone. I should have thought of it sooner, but Vincent had access to hotel guest information, including emergency contacts and personal details. He must have cloned your device during one of his visits to the suite." The self-recrimination in his voice made Sophia's chest ache. She reached out instinctively, placing her bandaged hand on his arm. The contact sent familiar electricity through her system, intensified by their proximity and the adrenaline coursing through both their veins. "This isn't your fault," she said softly. "I'm the one who kept my phone active instead of thinking about digital tracking." Alexander turned to face her fully, his storm gray eyes reflecting the monitor's glow. In the red-tinted darkness, he looked like something from her deepest fantasies. Dangerous and beautiful, and completely focused on her. "Everything about this situation is my fault," he replied, his voice rough with emotion she'd never heard before. "You saved my life, and I've repaid that kindness by making you a target, dragging you into my world where people die for making the wrong choices." The vulnerability in his admission broke something loose in Sophia's chest. This powerful man, This criminal who commanded respect and fear throughout Chicago was torturing himself with guilt over her circumstances. Without conscious thought, she stepped closer, eliminating the small distance between them. "I made my choice when I warned you," she whispered, acutely aware of how her breathing had quickened. "Everything that happened after was my decision too." Alexander's hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones with exquisite gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence happening above them. The monitors showed his men systematically eliminating Vincent's assault team, but Sophia couldn't focus on anything except the way Alexander was looking at her. "You don't understand what you're saying," he said. But his body betrayed his words, moving closer until she could feel heat radiating through his tactical clothing. "Getting involved with someone like me doesn't end well for innocent people." "Maybe I'm not as innocent as you think," Sophia replied, surprised by her own boldness. The confined space, the danger surrounding them, the weeks of building attraction, all combined to strip away her usual caution. Alexander's control visibly cracked. His hand slid from her face to her shoulders, then down her arms, ostensibly checking for injuries, but lingering with obvious desire. When his palms came to rest on her waist, Sophia's knees nearly buckled. "You're not hurt?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," she breathed, though that wasn't entirely true. She was hurt by his proximity, wounded by the careful distance he maintained even while touching her, aching with want that had been building since their first encounter. Alexander's hands moved lower, skimming her hips with professional thoroughness that felt anything but clinical. Sophia's pulse hammered as he knelt to check her legs for injuries she didn't have, his touch reverent and possessive simultaneously. When he stood again, they were so close that sharing breath seemed natural. Sophia tilted her face up, her lips parting in clear invitation. Alexander's eyes darkened with hunger that matched her own. "Sophia," he warned, but his head was already lowering toward hers. Their lips met in a kiss that was nothing like the gentle exploration Sophia had expected. This was desperate, hungry, fueled by weeks of tension, and the very real possibility that they might not survive the night. Alexander's hands tangled in her hair, while Sophia pressed against him, finally giving in to the attraction that had been consuming her. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "This can't happen," he said, though his arms remained locked around her. "Being close to me will get you killed." "Maybe," Sophia replied, her hands fisted in his shirt. "But right now, I'm more afraid of never knowing what this could be." The monitors showed the last of Vincent's assault team being neutralized, but Alexander's tension didn't ease. If anything, he seemed more agitated as he watched his men secure the perimeter. His jaw clenched with the kind of focus that suggested he was calculating variables Sophia couldn't see. "It's over," she said softly, but Alexander shook his head grimly. "This was reconnaissance," he replied, powering down the security feeds. "Vincent wanted to test our defenses, see how we respond to direct assault. He'll be back with better intel and more resources." Alexander destroyed her phone with methodical efficiency, crushing the device under his heel until it was nothing but plastic fragments and circuit boards. The finality of that action struck Sophia more than she'd expected, severing her last connection to the normal life she'd been clinging to. "We need to move," Alexander said, checking his weapon with practiced ease. "Vincent knows this location now, and he'll have identified our security protocols. Staying here is suicide." Within an hour, they were driving north through Illinois darkness, the city lights of Chicago fading behind them, as Alexander's Mercedes ate up highway miles with purring efficiency. Sophia had packed light at his insistence, bringing only essentials while trying to process how quickly her world had shifted from estate luxury to desperate flight. "Where are we going?" she asked, watching Alexander's profile in the dashboard glow. Even under stress, he was devastatingly attractive, his hands steady on the wheel despite the chaos they'd left behind. "Family cabin in Wisconsin," Alexander replied, his accent more pronounced when he was tired. "About 3 hours from Chicago, completely off the grid. Vincent doesn't know about it because it belonged to my mother's side of the family." The mention of his mother carried weight that Sophia sensed but didn't understand. In all their conversations, Alexander had revealed remarkably little about his personal history, keeping their interactions focused on present circumstances rather than past wounds. They drove in comfortable silence for the first hour, exhaustion and adrenaline creating a strange intimacy in the confined space. Sophia found herself studying Alexander's hands as they gripped the steering wheel, remembering how those same hands had touched her face in the panic room, gentle despite their obvious capacity for violence. "Why do you keep pushing me away?" she asked suddenly, the question emerging from thoughts she'd been trying to suppress for days. Alexander's knuckles tightened on the wheel. "Because getting close to people in my position ends badly. That's not an answer," Sophia pressed, her psychology training recognizing deflection when she heard it. "You want me. I can see it every time you look at me, every time you find excuses to touch me. So why fight it?" Alexander was quiet for so long that Sophia thought he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice carried pain that made her chest ache. "My father trusted his brother completely," he said, eyes fixed on the dark road ahead. "Uncle Marco was family, raised alongside my father, sworn to protect our bloodline. When rival families decided to eliminate the Romano leadership, Marco provided them with everything they needed: security protocols, family routines, safe house locations." Sophia's breath caught as understanding dawned. "He betrayed you. He betrayed everyone." Alexander continued, his voice hollow with old grief. "My parents, my younger sister, 3 cousins who were visiting for Sunday dinner. Marco arranged their deaths because he thought controlling the family would be easier than serving it." The casual revelation of such profound loss hit Sophia like a physical blow. She'd known Alexander was dangerous, had suspected violence in his past, but hearing about his family's massacre recontextualized everything about his careful distance, his reluctance to trust. "How old were you?" she whispered. 16, Alexander replied. "Old enough to understand what betrayal looked like. Young enough to believe I could have prevented it if I'd been smarter, more suspicious, less willing to trust blood relations." Sophia reached across the center console, placing her hand over his on the gear shift. The contact seemed to break something in Alexander's composure, his breathing becoming less controlled. "That's why you won't let yourself care about anyone," she said, understanding flooding through her. "Because caring makes you vulnerable. Caring gets people killed," Alexander corrected. But he didn't pull his hand away from hers. "Everyone I've ever loved has paid the price for my affection." "Not everyone," Sophia said softly. "Maria's still alive, still scolding you about anniversary dinners." Alexander's laugh held no humor. "Maria survived because she left Chicago immediately after the massacre. She lived in Rome for 10 years while I rebuilt the family. Only returned when she was certain I'd eliminated every threat to her safety." The cabin appeared through dense pine trees like something from a fairy tale. All rough-hewn logs and wide porches, completely isolated from the civilized world they'd left behind. Alexander cut the engine, and sudden silence enveloped them, broken only by wind through branches and the distant sound of water lapping against some unseen shore. Inside, the cabin was rustic but comfortable, clearly maintained despite its isolation. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, surrounded by furniture that looked handmade and well-loved. Alexander moved through the space with familiar ease, lighting oil lamps and checking window locks while Sophia stood uncertainly in the center of the room. "There's only one bedroom," Alexander said, without looking at her, his voice carefully neutral. "I'll take the couch." Something about his assumption triggered defiance in Sophia that surprised her. This beautiful, dangerous man had just revealed the deepest trauma of his life, trusted her with vulnerabilities he clearly shared with no one, and he was still trying to maintain distance between them. "Alexander," she said, and something in her tone made him turn to face her fully. She closed the distance between them in 3 determined steps, rising on her toes to press her lips to his, before he could voice whatever protest he was formulating. This time, she wasn't giving him the option to pull away, wasn't accepting his nobility as an excuse for denial. Alexander's resistance lasted approximately 2 seconds before he surrendered with a groan that vibrated through both their bodies. His hands came up to tangle in her hair, his mouth opening under hers with desperate hunger that matched the need she'd been fighting for weeks. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. "Sophia," he warned, but his hands were already moving to the buttons of her shirt. "I'm not your family," she whispered against his lips. "I'm not a 16-year-old boy who doesn't understand the world. I know exactly what I'm choosing." Alexander's control finally, completely shattered. Dawn filtered through pine branches outside the cabin windows, casting golden patterns across the rumpled sheets where Sophia lay wrapped in Alexander's arms. The past 5 days had passed in a blur of passionate nights and lazy mornings, punctuated by Alexander's increasingly urgent phone calls with his Chicago associates. Vincent had gone underground completely, which Alexander explained was far more dangerous than visible threats. "He's planning something comprehensive," Alexander said over breakfast on their 6th morning, his gray eyes reflecting worry she'd learned to recognize. Vincent never acts without overwhelming advantage. The silence means he's building resources. Sophia poured coffee into heavy ceramic mugs, movements more graceful than they'd been a week ago. Living with Alexander had refined her in subtle ways, teaching her to read his moods, anticipate his needs, navigate the careful dance of intimacy with someone whose life operated by rules she was still learning. "What kind of resources?" she asked, settling beside him at the rough-hewn kitchen table. "Money, weapons, manpower," Alexander replied grimly. "The Mexican cartels have deep pockets and deeper grudges. They want Chicago territory badly enough to fund a sustained campaign against my family." The casual mention of warfare over breakfast should have terrified Sophia, but 5 days of passionate domesticity had shifted her perspective dramatically. She no longer saw Alexander as a dangerous criminal who'd disrupted her life, but as the man who made her coffee exactly right, who held her through nightmares about Vincent's assault on the estate, who taught her card games by lamplight while storm winds howled outside. "Teach me to defend myself," Sophia said suddenly, the words emerging from thoughts she'd been developing all week. Alexander's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "What? You said Vincent will keep coming, that hiding isn't a permanent solution," Sophia continued, her psychology training helping her articulate the logic. "I can't spend the rest of my life being protected. I need to be able to protect myself, protect you if necessary." Something shifted in Alexander's expression, pride mixing with concern in ways that made her pulse quicken. "Combat training isn't like self-defense classes, Sophia. It requires mindset changes that might alter who you are fundamentally." "Maybe I need altering," she replied, surprising herself with the honesty. The old Sophia Martinez was naive enough to think warning a stranger about betrayal wouldn't have consequences. This Sophia needs to be smarter, stronger, more capable of surviving in your world. Alexander studied her face with the intensity she'd grown to love, searching for something that satisfied whatever internal criteria he applied to such decisions. Finally, he nodded. "We'll start this afternoon." Training began with basic situational awareness, Alexander teaching Sophia to read environments the way she'd learned to read people. How to identify exit routes, assess potential threats, recognize the subtle signs that preceded violence. His hands guiding her movements sent electricity through her system that had nothing to do with combat techniques. "Violence has patterns," Alexander explained, positioning her body to demonstrate proper defensive stances. Understanding those patterns means survival. Sophia found herself absorbing lessons with unexpected aptitude, her psychology background translating surprisingly well to tactical thinking. Reading micro-expressions became identifying pre-attack behaviors. Understanding motivation became predicting enemy actions. Alexander's praise for her progress carried warmth that made her chest tight with emotions she hadn't expected. Physical training followed, Alexander teaching her basic strikes, holds, and escapes with patience that contrasted sharply with his usual commanding presence. Every lesson became an exercise in controlled intimacy, his hands correcting her form, his voice guiding her movements, his proximity making concentration nearly impossible. "Focus," Alexander would murmur when her attention wandered to the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, or how his tactical pants emphasized the lean power of his thighs. "Distraction gets you killed." But Sophia suspected he was equally distracted, catching him watching her with hunger that had nothing to do with combat assessment. Training sessions inevitably devolved into passionate encounters, lesson plans abandoned in favor of exploring each other with desperate intensity that seemed to increase daily, rather than diminish. On their 10th night at the cabin, Alexander's phone rang at 2 a.m. The conversation was brief, conducted in rapid Italian that Sophia couldn't follow but recognized as bad news from Alexander's increasingly tense posture. "Vincent found us," Alexander said after ending the call, already moving toward the bedroom to pack their essential belongings. Government contacts provided him with property records going back 3 generations. They know about this cabin. Sophia's training kicked in automatically, her psychology background helping her compartmentalize fear while focusing on immediate necessities. She packed efficiently, her movements calm despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Alexander's lessons had prepared her for exactly this scenario. "How much time do we have?" she asked. Pulling on the dark clothing Alexander had taught her was essential for night movement. 20 minutes, maybe less," Alexander replied, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency. "They're approaching from the lake, probably planning to surround the cabin before dawn assault. The attack came sooner than expected, muzzle flashes erupting from the tree line like deadly fireflies." Alexander had been right about Vincent's improved resources. The assault coordinated and professional in ways that made the estate attack seem amateurish by comparison. "Stay low. Move fast. Exactly like we practiced," Alexander commanded, leading Sophia toward the cabin's rear exit. "If we get separated, head for the highway and flag down the first vehicle you see." But they didn't get separated. Sophia's training proved invaluable as they moved through dense forest, her newly developed awareness helping her avoid obstacles that might have slowed their escape. When one of Vincent's men tried to intercept them near the lake shore, Sophia didn't freeze or panic. Instead, she used the defensive techniques Alexander had drilled into her, creating enough confusion for Alexander to eliminate the threat permanently. They reached his hidden motorcycle as sirens began wailing in the distance, someone having reported the gunfire to local authorities. Alexander kick-started the bike with smooth efficiency, Sophia climbing behind him with movements that felt natural after days of physical training. The ride to the roadside motel took 40 minutes through back roads Alexander navigated with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Sophia pressed against his back, her arms tight around his waist, feeling more alive than she'd ever felt despite the mortal danger surrounding them. The Pineview Motor Lodge looked exactly like the kind of place people went to disappear, all flickering neon signs and rooms rented by the hour. Alexander paid cash for a room at the back, far from the highway and any curious eyes that might be watching. Inside the cramped space that smelled of disinfectant and cigarettes, they finally allowed themselves to acknowledge how close they'd come to dying. 3 days of hiding in the dingy motel had tested every limit of Alexander's patience. Sophia watched him pace the cramped space like a caged predator, his phone conversations becoming increasingly tense as Vincent's silence stretched longer. She'd learned to read the subtle signs of his mounting frustration, the way his jaw tightened when discussing strategy with his associates, how his hands flexed unconsciously when he felt trapped by circumstances beyond his control. The call that changed everything came at dawn on their 4th morning. Alexander's phone buzzed with unknown caller ID, but something in his expression as he answered suggested he'd been expecting this contact. "Romano," he said curtly, but Sophia saw his face drain of color as he listened. "Put her on." Sophia's stomach dropped as Alexander activated speaker mode, Carmen's terrified voice filling their small sanctuary. "Sophia? Oh God, Sophia, they have me in some warehouse, and they say they'll kill me if you don't—" Vincent's smooth voice cut through Carmen's panic. "Hello, Alex. I trust you remember my voice. Your girlfriend's little friend is quite chatty when properly motivated." Alexander's free hand clenched into a fist, knuckles white with controlled rage. "What do you want, Vincent?" "Simple exchange," Vincent replied, his tone carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd finally gained the upper hand. "Sophia Martinez for her coworker. Grand Metropolitan Hotel, tonight at midnight. Penthouse suite where this all began. Come alone and the waitress lives." The line went dead, leaving them staring at each other in the suffocating silence of the motel room. Sophia's training helped her process the implications quickly while fighting down panic for Carmen's safety. "It's a trap," Alexander said unnecessarily, but Sophia was already moving toward their packed bags. "Of course it's a trap," she replied, pulling on the dark tactical clothing Alexander had given her. "But Carmen doesn't deserve to die because I got involved in your world." Alexander caught her wrist, stopping her preparations. "You're not trading yourself for her." We'll find another way. There is no other way, Sophia said firmly, her psychology background helping her read Vincent's motivations. He chose Carmen specifically because he knows I'll sacrifice myself to save an innocent person. It's exactly what I did for you. That was different. How? Alexander struggled with an answer that wouldn't come. Sophia used his hesitation to continue packing, her movements efficient despite the emotional turmoil threatening to overwhelm her. We do this together, Alexander said finally. His voice carrying the kind of finality she'd learned meant further argument was useless. Vincent expects you to come alone, but he doesn't know about your combat training. That gives us an advantage. The drive back to Chicago passed intense planning. Alexander's associates had spent the past days mapping Vincent's likely resources, tracking his Mexican allies, identifying potential escape routes from the Grand Metropolitan. The operation they outlined was military in its precision, accounting for variables that Sophia's civilian mindset would never have considered. Vincent will have the penthouse rigged for surveillance, Alexander explained as they approached the city limits. But hotel maintenance tunnels provide alternative access routes. You know the building layout better than anyone. Sophia's intimate knowledge of the Grand Metropolitan's service corridors, staff elevators, and back passages suddenly became tactical intelligence. She guided Alexander through routes she'd used countless times during her housekeeping shifts, paths that would allow them to reach the penthouse undetected. The hotel looked exactly as she remembered, elegant and imposing against Chicago's skyline. But now it felt like approaching a battlefield rather than returning to work. Alexander's hand found hers as they entered through the employee entrance, his touch steadying despite the danger surrounding them. They moved through familiar hallways that felt foreign under these circumstances. Sophia led Alexander up maintenance stairwells she'd climbed hundreds of times, her psychology training helping her compartmentalize fear while focusing on Carmen's rescue. The penthouse suite was dark when they reached it, but Sophia could sense occupation in the subtle details her cleaning experience had taught her to notice. Fresh cigarette smoke lingered in the air, and expensive cologne that wasn't Alexander's marked Vincent's recent presence. Carmen sat bound to a chair in the center of the living room, her face streaked with tears, but showing the kind of stubborn defiance Sophia recognized from their countless shifts together. Vincent stood near the windows, flanked by two men whose tactical gear suggested professional military backgrounds. Right on time, Vincent said without turning around. Though I specified alone, Alex, your girlfriend's inability to follow simple instructions may cost her friend dearly. Let Carmen go, Sophia said, stepping into the room with hands raised to show she wasn't immediately armed. You have what you wanted. Vincent's laugh carried no humor. What I wanted was Alexander Romano's empire. What I'm settling for is his life, and the life of the woman who destroyed my plans. The confession clarified everything for Sophia's trained mind. Vincent's hatred wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal, fueled by years of resentment and perceived slights that had festered into homicidal rage. Alexander moved with lethal efficiency, his training superior to Vincent's hired muscle. The first man went down before he could draw his weapon, Alexander's precise strikes eliminating threats with controlled violence that should have horrified Sophia, but instead filled her with fierce pride. Vincent spun toward them, his own gun clearing its holster, but Sophia's combat lessons proved invaluable. She rolled toward Carmen while Alexander engaged Vincent, using furniture for cover while working to free her friend. The fight was brief, but brutal. Vincent's desperation made him reckless, his shots wild as Alexander closed distance with predatory purpose. When Vincent's gun clicked empty, Alexander's expression showed no mercy. This is for betraying family, Alexander said quietly, and Vincent's reign of terror ended permanently. Carmen sobbed with relief as Sophia untied her restraints, both women shaking from adrenaline and fear. But Sophia's attention remained fixed on Alexander, who stood among the aftermath of violence looking every inch the dangerous man she'd fallen in love with. In the suite where their story had begun, with Vincent's threat finally eliminated and Chicago's skyline glittering beyond the windows, Alexander pulled Sophia into his arms with desperate intensity. It's over, he whispered against her hair, his hands trembling as they traced her face, her shoulders, confirming she was whole and safe. Sophia rose on her toes to kiss him with passion that had nothing to do with their surroundings, and everything to do with the realization that they'd survived, that they could finally build something together without shadows from the past threatening their future. 3 months had passed since Vincent's death in the penthouse suite of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, and Sofia Martinez had officially become Sofia Romano in everything but legal name. The Lake Forest estate no longer felt like a safe house or temporary refuge, but home in ways she'd never experienced before. Alexander had transformed the guest wing into a private study, where she could continue her psychology degree, complete with high-end computer equipment and direct university connections that made remote learning seamless. This morning found her in Alexander's study, reviewing quarterly reports from the family's legitimate business holdings, while he conducted meetings with associates in the adjacent conference room. The transition from hotel housekeeper to criminal enterprise consultant should have felt surreal, but Sofia's psychology background translated surprisingly well to understanding human motivations in business contexts, even when those businesses operated in legal gray areas. Alexander emerged from his meeting looking satisfied, his expensive suit perfectly tailored to emphasize the lean power of his frame. Even after months of intimacy, the sight of him still sent heat through Sofia's system, their physical attraction remaining as intense as those first desperate nights at the Wisconsin cabin. "The Port Authority contracts are finalized," Alexander announced, settling into the leather chair beside her desk. "Completely legitimate shipping operations. No territorial disputes. No violence required for enforcement." Sofia smiled at the pride in his voice. Transitioning the Romano family operations toward legal enterprises had become their shared project, using her psychological insights to identify sustainable business models, while Alexander applied his strategic mind to implementation details. "What about the Chicago City Council proposal?" Sofia asked, referencing their plan to establish community development programs in former Romano territories. "Approved unanimously," Alexander replied, his gray eyes reflecting satisfaction that went deeper than simple business success. "The youth center construction begins next month, and the job training programs launch in 6 weeks. These legitimizing efforts represented more than strategic business decisions. They were Alexander's way of honoring the family legacy, while building something Sofia could be proud to be part of, creating positive community impact, rather than simply extracting profit through intimidation. "I have news," Sofia said, setting down the quarterly reports with hands that trembled slightly despite her attempts at composure. Alexander's attention sharpened immediately, his protective instincts always alert to any change in her emotional state. "What kind of news?" Sofia reached into her desk drawer, withdrawing the pregnancy test she'd taken that morning. The positive result had sent her mind reeling through implications she was still processing, excitement mixing with terror in ways that made rational thought nearly impossible. Alexander stared at the test for several heartbeats, his expressions cycling through surprise, joy, and protective concern, before settling into something that looked like wonder. "You're certain?" he asked quietly. "Dr. Martinez confirmed it yesterday," Sofia replied, referring to the discreet physician who handled medical needs for the Romano family. "About 6 weeks along." Alexander stood slowly, crossing to kneel beside her chair. His hands came up to frame her face with the exquisite gentleness she'd grown to love, thumbs tracing her cheekbones while his storm-gray eyes searched her features. "How do you feel about this?" he asked, and Sofia heard vulnerability beneath his careful tone. "Terrified," she admitted honestly. "But happy. Really, really happy." Alexander's smile transformed his entire face, revealing the young man who'd survived family massacre and betrayal to build something meaningful with her. When he leaned forward to kiss her, Sofia tasted joy and promise, and the kind of future she'd never imagined wanting. "We'll need to accelerate the legitimization timeline," Alexander said against her lips. "I want our child growing up in a world where their father's business doesn't require explanations or apologies." Over dinner that evening, Maria received their news with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been hoping for exactly this development. She immediately began planning nursery renovations and discussing the logistics of raising children in households that required security considerations. "The bambino will need protection," Maria said pragmatically, using the Italian endearment that made Sofia's chest warm. "But also, normalcy. We must balance safety with allowing them to experience childhood properly." Alexander nodded seriously, already calculating variables that came with expanding their family unit. Private school, carefully vetted social connections, gradual integration into legitimate society as our business transition completes. Watching him plan their child's future with the same strategic precision he applied to territorial negotiations filled Sophia with emotions she couldn't fully articulate. This dangerous man who'd survived betrayal and violence was preparing to become a father, transforming himself yet again to protect what mattered most. Later that night, as they lay entwined in the master bedroom that had become their sanctuary, Alexander traced patterns across Sophia's still flat stomach with reverent attention. "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly, his voice carrying wonder that made her throat tight with emotion. "Family, trust, someone who chose to stay despite knowing exactly what my world involves." "I didn't just stay," Sophia corrected, capturing his hand and pressing it firmly against her abdomen. "I chose to build something new with you." Alexander's eyes met hers in the lamplight, and Sophia saw the moment he truly understood what she was offering. Not just partnership in business or passion in bed, but the kind of trust that created families, built legacies, transformed dangerous men into devoted fathers. "Marry me," he said suddenly, the proposal emerging without preamble or elaborate planning. "Not for business advantages or strategic alliances, but because I want our child to have parents who chose each other completely." Sophia's answer came without hesitation. Yes. The wedding planning began immediately, though both agreed on something simple and private, rather than the elaborate ceremonies typically associated with crime family traditions. Maria insisted on a church ceremony, while Sophia requested only Carmen and a few close friends as witnesses. 2 weeks later, as Sophia stood in Maria's carefully tended garden wearing an elegant but understated white dress, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The terrified hotel housekeeper who'd overheard betrayal plans had evolved into someone capable of building an empire alongside the man she loved. Alexander looked devastatingly handsome in his dark suit, storm-gray eyes reflecting joy as he watched her approach through Maria's rose arbor. When they exchanged vows written in both English and Italian, Sophia felt the pieces of her new life clicking into place with satisfying finality. "You saved more than my life that night at the hotel," Alexander whispered, during their first dance as husband and wife. "You taught me that trust doesn't always lead to betrayal, that some people stay when things get dangerous instead of running toward safety." Sophia smiled up at him, her hands resting on his shoulders while their guests celebrated around them. "You taught me that being strong enough to protect what matters isn't the same as being violent, that some rules are worth breaking for the right reasons." As Chicago's skyline glittered beyond the garden lights, Sophia knew their story was just beginning.